Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Match+Book series on the EBPL podcast. My name is Paul. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at EBPL. If you're new to the Match+Book series, what we do is we try to take user-submitted questions and try to provide personalized recommendations based on a whole bunch of different genres and book types and that kind of thing. But every once in a while, what we like do is kind of break that mold a little bit. And I like to talk about what I've been reading personally and some of my favorite books I've read over the past year. And this year, it's been a lot of nonfiction. I'm not sure exactly why. Kind of comes and goes in waves. I find sometimes it'll be heavy nonfiction. Sometimes it'll be just mystery novels for a few months. But whatever it is, whatever the case, it always seems to come back around. And I love narrative nonfiction, something that tells a good story, something that feels almost like a novel, but is actually just a nonfiction book. So the first book I read that really piqued my interest this year was Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain. If anybody's ever seen any of his many television shows and you're familiar with that aspect of his career, the writing style is very similar to the voiceover narration he provides in the beginning of the episodes, where it's filled with a lot of wit, humor, lots of description of what he's encountering in his career at the time. So if you haven't already read him, you have heard some of his works. He obviously writes those out on his own ahead of time, and that is kind of the entry point that I would say for what the book feels like. So he was fairly known before this in the culinary field, but this book really is what made him a mainstream celebrity. This was his foray into the mainstream culture rather than just the culinary world. And it also made him a pariah in the field for a little bit because he revealed too much about what goes on in a kitchen of a restaurant rather than just the front of the house. So it is unfiltered in that way. There's lots of swearing, lots of debauchery, and lots of things that actually happen in a restaurant that we do not see. So it's a very enjoyable read in that way, kind of peeling back the curtain, but also giving a look into his life and his career up until that point that has brought him through so many different restaurants and so many different varied experiences, some extremely fruitful and some where he's just working for people who don't have the best intentions, and what that kind of looks like for a professional chef. I promise if you read this and you really don't know that much about what goes on in a kitchen of a restaurant, you will learn a lot, and probably too much, I would say, about the people who work there and also what they think of their customer base and what type of meals are served for what reason. For instance, like he has rules about what you should order at different times. Certain days you should order fish or not order fish based on when restaurants get their shipments, that kind of thing. I think what appealed so much to me is that this is like a near universal experience of going out to a restaurant. So it's something that we share with everybody else, but we all have different views of it and what goes on there. So to see that from the other side of the curtain of the people working in the restaurants and what they think of the customers, but also how they develop the experience for the customer is really interesting to see in that perspective. It also provides a good look into the whole ecosystem of a restaurant, who does what job and why. And we like to think it's just the chefs back there making the food, whereas it is this whole hierarchy with dozens of people doing all different types of jobs. And he really lays it out for you, does a great job of explaining all the different types of jobs and how that all comes together to make everything click into place, which I never knew before personally, and I don't think a lot of people know. And it kind of crystallized it for me, how this whole thing works from that perspective. And again, if you like seeing Bourdain on camera in many of his wonderful shows, he comes across on the page very similarly as charismatic, passionate, eloquent, and funny and human as well. So he really lays it all out there for you and doesn't try to beat around the bush. And that's what I think I appreciate so much about this book. Another book I read this year that I particularly enjoyed is called The Wide, Wide Sea by Hampton Sides. And it is the story of Captain James Cook, who was already lionized as the greatest explorer in British history, setting off on his third voyage to try to do many things. It is a tale of contact with tribes around the world to try to get a better sense of what type of people live in what type of places all across the world. It is a tale of imperial ambition trying to, I would say, in some senses, conquer places, but in other senses, forging diplomatic relations with tribes all across the world. And the real purpose we get to at the end is Cook really trying to find a Northwest Passage through Alaska and what that kind of looks like. And Hampton Sides does a wonderful account of what the journey looks like for Cook, his legacy, and the efforts his crew went to, facing continual danger. This is happening in the 1700s, so they're facing a lot of uncontacted tribes at the time, and really gets a good look at Cook as a person as well as the leader of this crew. Also, this is the first time that people from England were encountering and writing about their experiences with people who lived on the Hawaiian Islands. So that's its own kind of unique perspective that you don't see too often. Although this is a book that came out just this year, the author includes a lot of firsthand accounts of people who were there at the time and what that was like. So you really feel almost like you're a member of the crew along for the ride on this voyage. It really does seem like that. It has such a sweeping quality to it, like the beautiful, majestic descriptions of nature that are along the way. They're so vivid that you almost feel like you are there with them. Of course, the other side of that is how truly disgusting some aspects of being a member of the crew was at the time. So you get this really amazing dissonance between the natural descriptions and what it was like to work on a boat at the time. And it's important that the author does provide this context because we start in England with Captain Cook lobbying King George III as to why he should be able to set out on this voyage, why he should be worthy of it, why the king should allocate this money. And so we start there. And during the interim, we see Captain Cook go from starting in England, going to Cape Town, Tahiti in the South Pacific, then the western coast of the United States, and then the Bering Strait. So we're getting such wildly different types of encountering so many different peoples, but also so many different landscapes. And we're ping-ponging between tropical paradises and these ice flows of the Northwest Passage. So it really does show what it's like at the time for people to set out on a quest with really just a concept of a plan, but no full-scale plan in place because they couldn't exactly imagine who and what they were going to encounter along the way. So this kind of trepidation and excitement that comes from that is really comes through in the writing itself. I would say my favorite part was just them setting ashore, in Tahiti, in Hawaii, in Cape Town, to all these places where they don't know anybody, but are taking the risk, taking the gamble that they're just going to have these offerings and say, we come of peace, and that people will respond accordingly. And they will somehow, without speaking the same language, come to some amicable agreement to let them stay there or let them dock ashore. And that, to me, is so baffling, almost, that you could do that and that it would work out. And it's really amazing to see that play out for the crew. The last book that I really enjoyed reading this year is called The Art Thief, and that is by Michael Finkel. And this is a different sort of true crime nonfiction book. Definitely stands alone, very different from a lot of the other ones. And it's a story of a Frenchman named Stephen. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. He was a prolific art thief in the early 2000s in Europe, and he stole hundreds upon hundreds of different pieces, The author did interview Stephen, so he gets these vivid accounts from Stephen himself about how he would do these heists. And some of them were massive pieces, paintings that were 50 feet long, sculptures, whole sets of flatware. And the stories of how he carried out the heists, along with his girlfriend, who often acted as a diversion or a lookout or a guide in some capacity, is really amazing in that sense. It almost feels like you're reading about a Looney Tunes episode in the way he describes Stephen's approach to some of these things, because what you're seeing is just unbridled compulsion on Stephen's behalf, and he can't help himself but steal these items. So he becomes very creative in finding ways where he can actually carry out the heist. Again, we're all over Europe in this. We are in museums, cathedrals, small houses that just happen to have a few pieces in them and are like temporary museums. And it's all being housed. Stephen lives with his mother and his girlfriend, and it's all being housed in a small upstairs room that he and his girlfriend live in together. And the picture of hundreds of priceless works of art in this small upper story of a tiny house is really just, that kind of hooked me on the book. You know, what type of people we're getting into, what type of mind we are reading about. It's also interesting because a lot of people, when you think true crime, you're thinking a heist, and then the second part would be a way to sell that. And like I said, he retained all of these pieces. What we're seeing is somebody with very specific taste. And when he saw something that really spoke to him, he had to have it. It had to be his, and it had to live with him in his room. And so it never crosses his mind that he would actually sell the pieces. It is a mix of athleticism, of gall and planning, and of an addiction to the theft itself, and a real affinity for the art as well. So what you're seeing is all of these compelling aspects forged into one criminal narrative, and the whole physical and psychological layers brought to life by Finkel's writing in this really great, enthralling way, and in a beautiful, imaginative story. Those are my 3 favorite books I've read in this past year. Some new, some old, but for some reason, it just seems to be nonfiction at the time. So I want to say thank you to everybody for listening, and thank you to Melissa Hozick for editing this episode. More episodes of the Match+Book series can be found at ebpl.org/podcast. Thank you all for listening.